It's the Get Foxy Show. Today's guest, Nancy Yen Shipley. And Nancy, you're an MD
That's right.
specializing in orthopedic surgery.
That is correct.
Yeah. Now, I didn't want you specifically on the show because you're an orthopedic doc, but because you have a podcast called The 6%. And that kind of plays into your profession because there aren't very many women specializing in orthopedic surgery, are there?
That's correct. The 6%, the title of my podcast is pulled from some of the data of how many women are in active practice within orthopedic surgery. So as you can see, that's not a lot of us girls.
I'm curious, how did you end up becoming an orthopedic surgeon? Was this something that you always wanted to do as a kid, or did your profession kind of fall in your lap? How did that all fall into place for you?
Well, it's a little bit of a circuitous route. I took a very non-traditional route into medicine, and you and I have a little bit of something in common in that I attended acupuncture school for a little while. After college, I did not end up practicing. But I went into college initially at UCLA thinking, okay, I'm going to be a pre-med, I'm going to go into medicine, and for not the right reasons. I thought it was a good profession because my parents did, and it was kind of the classic Southern California Asian child of immigrant parents. That was seemed like the thing to do. I got weeded out pretty quickly from pre-med, and I ended up a psychology major and not really knowing exactly what I wanted to do after college. So I worked in the snowboarding industry. I then ended up getting pulled into a family business. I helped my stepdad run his business. We traveled around and taught. He taught classes. I helped him organize these events and learned a little bit about running a small business. He is a qigong master. Uh, and so, I learned a lot about the practice of qigong and traditional Chinese medicine from him. And he is definitely like one of the one of the folks you see on TV or you hear about in stories where he actually lived in a cave with his Taoist master in China as an apprentice for a while, cleaning and sweeping the floors and cooking and carrying buckets of water up a hill to study the art. And so anyway, I worked with him for a couple of years. That's how I ended up learning about acupuncture. And as I was on this interesting journey, I kind of rediscovered that I wanted to go full circle and realized I did actually want to go to medical school. And so I came into medicine with a little bit of a different background, with some understanding of the foundations of traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture. And I mean, it's kind of funny when you look back. I could, you go from traditional medicine and something that is non-invasive to what I do, which is maximally invasive. So it's a little bit ironic, but I still have a great, healthy appreciation for the role of acupuncture and Chinese medicine, even in what I do today. And I ended up discovering orthopedics just by shadowing a family friend. Realizing that I love working with my hands and seeing how much of an impact surgery such as a hip replacement can make for an individual who is hobbled and barely able to walk, and going from that to being able to walk into the surgeon's office the week after surgery without pain. So that was massively impressive to me, and it led to my interest in orthopedics, and I decided to pursue it as my specialty. Uh, as I went into orthopedic rotations, it kind of didn't really occur to me that there weren't a lot of women. and I just forged ahead anyway. And I was actually surprised when I started to get comments about, well, girls aren't really strong enough to do this. And, you can't have a family. You'll never find a husband. I mean, all sorts of crazy things trying to deter me from the specialty. And the more people told me I couldn't do it, the more I wanted to do it. So that's how I ended up here.
That sounds like some pretty tough challenges that you had to run up against with that initial resistance.
Absolutely. I mean, eh, I think a lot of people just didn't really put a lot of thought. There were individuals who tried to deter me from orthopedics simply because they had an opinion of what women should and shouldn't do. And so they were exerting that upon me and my career choice. But I would say there was a fair amount of those comments coming from people who just didn't know, or people who said, oh, well, you don't see a lot of women. So, and just the various misconceptions about what orthopedic surgery is actually about. And I think that I'm glad that I chose to ignore those comments. I have talked to women who are in medical school or hoping to go into medical school who have an early interest in orthopedics. And I hear way too many stories of these women being deterred from the profession because of other people's comments, most of the time from outside of orthopedics.
Isn't that a shame?
It's a shame.
So you created the 6% podcast in order to kind of help support women in that sort of position? How did the
Absolutely.
6% podcast come around?
So the concept of women thriving in male dominated fields has been swirling around in my head for some time, years, in fact. And the first time I thought about some of the commonalities that women in male dominated careers have was when I was going through an airport. I saw a female captain of a commercial airline, and she was heading this way and I was heading that way, and I had to catch a flight. I'm sure she had to go fly a plane. And I was like, gosh, I wish I had 10 minutes to sit down with her and have a coffee and just ask her what it was like, going through aviation training and then being in this boys club of flying commercial airlines and being a captain, no less. I could tell by the stripes on her shoulder that she wasn't the oh, what is it called? Uh, the second pilot is called the first. Help me here.
I
Anyway,
wish I knew.
I know that just shows my ignorance here, but anyway, she was a captain, and I realized that we probably had a lot of things in common, even though we were in completely different fields. And so that idea has been in the back of my mind, and it wasn't until I started listening to podcasts and meeting other physicians who not only podcast but are just doing interesting things outside of plain old clinical medicine. And I said, you know what? This would be a really interesting podcast to create. There are, I'm sure, lots of interesting stories out there and lots of women in various different professions that I could talk to. And so I started thinking about it. I started planning and doing a little bit of research as a fledgling podcaster. And when the COVID pandemic hit, I felt, and like everybody else, felt like the world was crashing down around us. We're stuck at home. Everything has come to a halt. And at first I was thinking, oh my gosh, my dream of doing a podcast has just come to an end. And after about a week, I kind of snapped out of it. And I said, you know what? This is actually the perfect time to start recording and launching a podcast, because everybody else is stuck at home. There's no better time than to get caught up in podcasts. And also, for some of the higher profile podcast guests that I ended up getting, everything on their schedule was cleared. And so people who I maybe normally would have trouble getting on their schedule for them to guest, were like, well, MLB season's just been canceled. And so I was able to get Rachel Balkovec on my show. She is the first full-time Major League Baseball female coach. She was the first guest of my podcast, and I got all these other amazing women that I got to talk to. And as you alluded to before we started, in my normal everyday life as an orthopedic surgeon, I am blessed to meet and treat so many different people, but I never would have crossed paths with these amazing women otherwise. And so it's just been this great, really self-fulfilling and amazing journey to be able to host this podcast.
Oh man, isn't that cool? That is that is so much the fun part about podcasting, and meeting and getting to chat with these women. I'm sure that you get some very fascinating conversations. I listened into a couple of episodes and was just like, wow, this is pretty fascinating stuff. I mean, even just as a
Thank you.
guy, um, and the conversations that you have, I think, um, are really pertinent, kind of in today's society, and especially, as a Chinese medicine practitioner, my mind thinks a lot about yin and yang balance,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
the divine feminine and the divine masculine, and how difficult it has to be for a woman in a field that's primarily dominated by men to stay in her feminine, and
Absolutely.
not necessarily take on that yang masculine energetic.
Right, right. And I think, and I totally appreciate what you're saying. And I think that you see women in orthopedic surgery, and a lot of us are now so much more comfortable in our own skin and comfortable expressing ourselves as women and not having to fit that male mold. And I talked to some of the women who are a generation ahead of me and who went through training when the numbers were even less than 6%. And the stories that they've told me, many of them are heartbreaking. A lot of them have really had to shed a lot of that female yin part of themselves to be able to fit in. And I'm really seeing a movement now of women saying, you know what, I'm a little bit yin, I'm a little bit yang, and this is who I am. And so be it. Take me as I am. I'm an orthopedic surgeon. I also like nail polish. It just doesn't, you don't have to get rid of the things that make you you as a woman going into orthopedics these days, I think. And we should promote that.
Who were some of the most favorite guests that you've had on the show so far?
Oh boy. It is really, really hard to pick favorites because I enjoyed talking to each and every one. I think one of the things I like best is when I get a little bit of a peek into a field or a career that I know nothing about. And so it was fantastic talking, as I mentioned, to Rachel Balkovec, Major League Baseball coach. It was really cool to talk to both Kimmy Kolb and Vicky White, both of whom are in the film industry. I don't really have any experience there except for when I extraed in college. That was the extent of my experience. And it just the pearls that some of them shared, the stories that they shared, it was just very fascinating for me to learn about their lives and take a peek behind the curtain, and also to learn that we actually have so much in common. So and I have the second season coming out soon, probably in maybe another 3 weeks from the time that we're talking now. And I've got some really cool women on that season as well, including a fighter pilot. I've got Michelle Curran, Air Force pilot on there. I've got a couple of other of my sisters in medicine in fields where there aren't a lot of women also on the show. And I've got um, Muffy Davis, who is a multiple Olympic medal holder, both in the Paralympics hand cycling as well as downhill skiing. And so I've got a lot of women in the upcoming season too who are also on my list of favorites. So long-winded answer to your question. It's so hard to pick a favorite.
Well, I don't know if somebody asked me about this show too, I don't know if I could necessarily say, well, yeah, so and so is my favorite. I mean, it's kind of like picking which one of your children is your favorite.
Exactly.
Well, what are some of the most common questions that you get about the show from listeners?
Well, I will get questions about, well, how did you find these guests? And I'm pretty active on social media, and several of the guests I just connected with uh, just cold on social media, on Twitter primarily. As I've come across women who do interesting things and are minorities in their field, I have reached out and said, hey, I've got this podcast. I would love to have you on. And 99% of the time, these women are just so gracious and say, absolutely. I love it. I love the cause. I love sharing what I do. I would love to see more women come into my field. Some of the women in medicine I am personally acquainted with, and I've had a couple in which listeners or friends have said, hey, I know someone who you really need to talk to. And I've had many recommendations made to me. So I have been really fortunate in that I have no shortage of amazing guests. And my biggest challenge is finding more hours in the day so that I can keep working on this podcast.
You are definitely a busy lady. Holy cow. I mean, between your speaking gigs, your podcast, and then your practice, and then you're a mom too, correct?
I'm a mom. I have an 8-year-old.
Yeah. So, I mean, you are rocking and rolling.
I wear a lot of hats, sometimes all at once.
Well, I'm going to ask you the question I ask all my guests, Nancy, and that
Okay.
is, what does Foxy and being Foxy mean to you?
To me, it means being one hot mama. I love the name of your show, and I think what it means is embracing all the parts of yourself, having self-confidence, believing in yourself, and knowing that you can accomplish great things. And even in the face of the imposter syndrome, for example, knowing that you can overcome that and talk yourself out of it and achieve everything that you want for the life that you feel is worth living and leaving a legacy. I think in a nutshell, that's what that means to me.
You mentioned imposter syndrome. I think this is something that's pretty common, especially in the women in our culture. Not to say us guys don't get it too, because I definitely deal with that myself. But when dealing with imposter syndrome, how have you personally broken through those barriers? Because I'm sure that you've felt that in your life from time to time.
Absolutely. I still feel it. I think knowing it has a name and knowing that that syndrome even exists is one big first step, because I spent so many years, my younger years, feeling like I don't belong here, I don't deserve this, and then I sell myself short and I don't reach for those dreams that seem maybe a little bit out of reach. And once I realized it was a thing, I said, "Oh, that's what I'm suffering from." And then the second thing that has helped greatly is actually making a list of everything that I have accomplished And just looking at it, I mean, sometimes even just looking at my CV, I'm like, oh, I've actually done a lot. I actually do deserve to be here. I actually do deserve that next job or to have that speaking gig, and people actually want to listen to me, and it's a little bit of a push and pull because it always creeps back in, and sometimes right before a speaking engagement, I will have my heart fluttering and I'll be like, I've made a terrible mistake. But in agreeing to do this, but it's kind of you gotta recognize, okay, it's happening. You take a deep breath, you take a step back, and you go, nope, I got this. And so I think recognizing it and also recognizing everything that you've accomplished so far are two of the first steps in overcoming it.
It's definitely a challenge to first recognize imposter syndrome and then saying, okay, I've got this. I don't feel worthy, but I'm going to step forward anyway. So that's really, there's a lot of bravery involved, isn't there?
I think so, but at the same time, that bravery exists in all of us. It's there. It is there. And then also recognizing that it's not something that you cure yourself of. It's something that'll visit every once in a while, and you got to be like, I recognize you and I know what to do with you.
Out of curiosity, who embodies foxiness in your world right now?
Oh my gosh. I have so many people that I look up to, both men and women within medicine, outside of medicine. I think, gosh, this is a really hard question. Hmm. Well, I think I will draw on maybe some of my friends that I admire and look up to. Two that come to mind. One is my good friend Jennifer Weiss. She and I will add Dr. Vonda Wright as well. Dr. Weiss and Dr. Wright are both guests on my intro episode to my second season of the podcast. They're also both colleagues in orthopedics and also just women that I really look up to. They embody what I strive to be, and I consider myself very lucky to call them friends as well. And I realized as I was interviewing them and doing a Zoom meeting, much like we are, I just had these like warm, fuzzy, gushing feelings. I'm like, oh my gosh, I get to call these ladies my friends, and I get to have them on my podcast. So I felt very, very fortunate. They just excel in their field of orthopedics, but they get themselves out there as writers, as producers of multimedia material that support their brand, and their moms. And so I would say those two ladies are definitely some of the foxiest in my sphere.
Now that is fantastic. One of the things I was told by one of my coaches is you are the sum of the five people that you tend to hang out with the most.
Hmm.
And so when you've got folks like that in your circle, that you can go, oh my gosh, they're like who I want to be like them. And a lot of times, they'll look back at you and go, well, I kind of want to be like you, but you're able to lift one another up, and it
Absolutely.
makes such a great dynamic.
Absolutely. I'm lucky to have such women in my sphere, and they're just but two of them, but I have several that I just really look up to.
What is the one piece of advice, if you were to give my listeners one piece of advice on how to stay foxy, maintain that foxiness, what would it be?
I would say know your core values and make sure you continue to live them. I think it's a really good self-assessment to ask yourself what is truly at your core that is important to you. What are those values? Is it family? Is it independence? Is it fame? You know, whatever it is, whether it doesn't have to have a positive or a negative connotation to it, figuring out what those values are helps to guide you in just about everything that you do, whether it is your personal relationships, your friendships, your business, your career, your hobbies. If you keep the things that you're doing under the umbrella of your core values, then you're going to live the foxy life. You know, you're going to be foxy. And so I try to revisit that frequently and look at, hey, are all my obligations and all the things that I'm doing and everything I signed up for, does that still fit? And then learning to say no when it doesn't, I think is really important.
That's big stuff right there. Learning, just the art of learning to say no is
Yeah.
huge.
I've had a hard time with that through my life, and I finally learned it's okay. The world's not going to end.
I may have just lost your audio, Nancy. No worries.
And the system, is that working?
Oh, now you're back on.
That is very odd. I'm not really sure because it says, yeah, it says it's the same mic, but okay.
Hmm?
I'm back.
We're back on. No worries. Well, now that we've had that little brief interruption, how can people find the 6% podcast, and how can they get a hold of you if they want more information about your speaking, your podcast, or your practice?
So the 6% with Nancy MD is on all major podcast platforms. You can find me on Apple, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Just search for the 6% with Nancy MD. My website is nancymd.com. It has all of my information on there, both my clinical, my writing, my speaking, my podcast. Everything lives on that website. I'm also on social media. So on Twitter and Instagram, I'm underscore Nancy MD. And you can also search for me on Facebook.
Excellent. And I will have all of those links up on the show notes. So, y'all, take a listen to the 6% podcast. You will hear some just amazing stories from some very powerful women. So definitely check it out. Nancy, thank you so much for taking the time and spending it with me today. I so appreciate what you're doing, helping promote women in the world and bringing more health, healing, and light onto this planet. You are an amazing individual.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to be on with you.